Hello and welcome. I'm joined today by Dr. Hicham Safieddine, who is Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in the History of the Modern Middle East at the University of British Columbia. Thank you so much for joining me, Hicham.
Thank you for having me, Omar.
It's great to have you, and you're joining us from Lebanon, which has seen a really dramatic and brutal escalation by Israel in terms of its attacks throughout the country. I would like to start off by asking you to give us an overview of this latest Israeli aggression on Lebanon. What do you think are the strategies and goals and the basic impact, at least at the humanitarian level, if not the broader level, that these attacks are having?
So let me begin by giving you and the viewers an overview indeed of the scale and nature of Israel's attacks. And then we can perhaps discuss the objectives and the strategic plan that Israel has or doesn't have for this war. So since starting from October 7 or October 8, and according to the Minister of Health, Lebanon's Minister of Health, who was speaking as we record or spoke just earlier today, there is over 2,300 people have been killed by Israeli attacks and strikes. We have almost or over 11,000 injured. There are reports, according to the Minister of Health as well, that we've got perhaps 130 hospitals or health facilities that have been attacked and destroyed either partially or totally. There's an estimate of over 100 medics that have been killed by Israel since the beginning. We also have, according to the Minister of Agriculture, so in addition to the human cost, the human lives lost and killed, there's an estimate of close to 6,000 hectares of land that has been burnt due to Israeli bombardment. There's an estimated 60 to 66,000 heads of cattle, which is a major source of livelihood for many Lebanese, rural Lebanese populations that has been killed. We have tens of thousands of olive trees that have been burnt and destroyed. And I would remind everyone that this is the olive harvest season, and the major basket, a food basket for many people in the south of Lebanon, of the region of Jabal Amr, rely on olives as a major produce. So the Israel's, in sum then, what we are seeing is a almost not yet a Gaza doctrine approach of a scorched earth approach of the targeting of civilian areas and populations, urban, particularly in Dahi, the southern suburb of Beirut. But we have also seen targeting of displaced people, just like we saw, except not as on the same accelerated level in Gaza. We are seeing the targeting of displaced Lebanese by the Israelis in all of Lebanon, including as far north as the governorate, for example, of Zgharta. Now, if you look at this big picture, you realize that the Israelis, their declared objective is to return the settlers to the north of Palestine. And of course, this objective has changed over time. So this was initially the objective. But after the pager attacks, one of the largest attacks of mass mutilation in modern history, the Israelis became, elated, and they started speaking of, completely destroying Hezbollah and the resistance in general. So their objective was actually broadened and widened. And on top of that, they also spoke of a new Middle East. This is another strategy that many of us are aware of from 2006. Where this is the colonial and imperialist imagination of the American and Israeli front of reshaping our region, of undermining the basic rights and sovereignty of the states of the region. And so far, the war on Lebanon has transferred from a war of attrition, which was taking place since October 8, up and now since September 17, I would argue, since the pager attack, it has transitioned into an all-out war. So these are the objective of the Israelis. We should keep in mind that Israel also historically has had colonial ambitions in South Lebanon. So as a historian, I can tell you that as early as the early Zionists when the Zionists were thinking of how they would imagine the land of Israel in Palestine, they sent emissaries to buy land, and they spoke about the potential borders. And Saida, which is close to 70 kilometers north of Lebanon, this is north of the Litani River, was included as a potential area. So you can see that Israel's ambitions are not just simply destroying Hezbollah, but also potentially, if there's a possibility, expanding back into Lebanon and even possibly resettling it. We have a history of Israeli expansion in South Lebanon. The first major attempt was, of course, in 1948. They tried to capture as many villages as they can. And then in 1978, they invaded as well, long before Hezbollah, became a power, to deal with. And then we have the major invasion of 1982, which went all the way to Beirut. And then we have, of course, the 2006 war. So we have to think about this strategically in terms of both a scorched earth policy of creating potentially a dead zone in South Lebanon, destroying resistance, and of course, decoupling. That's another strategic goal, decoupling Lebanese front from the Gaza front. And maybe finally, and we can speak about this later on, one thing that's specific to Lebanon and not to Gaza is the sectarian makeup of Lebanon's political system. And they are trying to capitalize on that to basically incite civil strife and undermine the collective support, the popular solidarity that has actually arisen to support the displaced and to stand against Israel's among the Lebanese population. So that's another strategy, another tactic that we can also discuss.
Thank you. And I definitely want to get back to the kind of the political and the sectarian kind of implications that Israel is trying to stoke in Lebanon. But one thing that you said, I wanted to kind of step back and ask you to explain a little bit more, because I think a lot of people, particularly in the US and elsewhere, were rightly focused on the genocide in Gaza, basically, and may not know what has been happening as much detail, perhaps, on the Lebanese front. Could you take us back a little bit and describe to us what, how would you characterize what Hezbollah has been doing since October 7th, 2023, and since the launch of the full-scale attacks by Israel on Gaza? How do you characterize the kind of military actions of Hezbollah, or the support front, as they called it, for those who weren't following closely? And then there's, as you said, it escalated from a war of attrition into an all-out confrontation. There's a lot of speculation about why Israel did this. Is this something they planned all along? Is this something that they saw an opportunity because of what people are saying was, the resistance and the Iran and kind of resistance axis was not, was basically, thought they had a deterrent, but Israel wanted to kind of escalate that. Can you describe a little bit kind of the actions and then maybe your analysis of the escalation?
Sure. So let me begin by saying our eyes need to continue, obviously, to be on Gaza. And the genocide that is unfolding in Gaza is at the heart and the core of this conflict, and remains so, because at the end of the day, this war is about, for the Israeli settler colonial state, they describe it as a war of independence. And we know very well what that means. It means it's a war of ethnic cleansing. It's a war of the confiscation and conquest of Arab land, and it's the war of the expulsion of Arab populations in Palestine. And the flip side of that, which I think many of us express when we say from the river to the sea, is the liberation of Palestine. So I want to emphasize here that the Lebanese front cannot be seen in isolation, definitely, of Palestine and the Gaza front. And this is not simply because of the actions of Hezbollah, but because of the geography and history of Jabal Amil, or South Lebanon, and Palestine all along, from the very beginning of this project. So this is the general larger context of what was going on. So let's now turn to what happened on the Lebanese front on October 8th. Firstly, for those of you, for the viewers who are not as informed about Lebanon, the last major confrontation, unlike Gaza, which had witnessed several wars between 2005 and 2024, we had a major war in 2006. And after this war, there was the resolution came out called Resolution 1701, which actually was very biased in favor of Israel. And we'll talk more about the politics of what's going on now with Lebanon afterwards. But there has been consistent and thousands of violations of Lebanese airspace. There's also been occasional violations on the ground in terms of the eating up land grabs, small land grabs in parts of what is continues to be an occupied Arab land, which is Sheba Farms and the hills of Kfar Shuba. Now, Hezbollah, all along since 2006, has taken on a deterrent position, concerned about these ambitions, these existing ambitions. The Israel's ambitions also increased as a result of the discovery of gas in the East Mediterranean, and there was eventually an arrangement between the two sides to manage the extraction of gas and to draw the borders between Lebanon and occupied Palestine in the water. So there was actually a drawing of borders in the water, but there wasn't on land. And the Israelis wanted to delineate the border on land, and obviously for good reason, the Lebanese were hesitant. So this is the context on October 6th or October 7th. Tension, there's the mutual deterrence, there are some efforts to delineate the borders, the land borders after delineating the seafront. What happened on October 8th, and not everyone knows this, but the Hezbollah actually decided to launch what it called a backup front or a support front, Jabhat Isnad. And what they did, by the way, is to attack Israeli positions in the occupied Sheba Farms. So they didn't actually attack northern occupied Palestine. So this was within fully the limits of the purview of the right to self-defense and to armed resistance against occupation. But this was intended to release pressure from the Gaza front. And if you look at the early attacks of Hezbollah, you're going to notice that many of them were actually targeting surveillance positions of the Israeli army on the northern front in order to prevent the Israelis from actually potentially invading Lebanon, because the Hezbollah was worried that once the Israelis get done with Gaza, or even before that, if they have an opportunity, they're going to also attack Lebanon. So Hezbollah's attacks were very measured. They were actually tit for tat. They were intended to destroy the capacity of the Israelis to launch an offensive on Lebanon. They were also intended to divert some of the military forces of the Israeli army into the northern front to reduce the tension or to reduce the impact on Gaza. And up until September of this year, they generally avoided, launching very powerful, destructive attacks. And they kept, and if we listen to Nasrallah's speeches before he was assassinated or killed, we will actually notice that he's constantly telling the Israelis, don't invade Lebanon, because if you do, we're going to attack you. And he's always saying, so as once there's a ceasefire in Gaza, we are going to automatically stop our attacks. So that's what Hezbollah was doing. And people were debating whether this gradual war of attrition is in favor of the axis of resistance, whether it was tactically useful or not. Some people were calling for a very strong strike right away. But also we have to keep in mind, unlike Gaza as well, the Lebanese internal situation. Many people did not even agree to a war of attrition. Many people were trying to actually blame Hezbollah for starting this war. And the media here in Lebanon, many members of civil society, the political factions, they're at Hezbollah's neck. So I think part of the calculation was to also keep in mind Lebanese dynamics and to avoid being fully blamed. Not to mention, of course, the balance of power. We should not forget, as strong and commendable the resistance is, Israel still has, aerial superiority, even though Hezbollah has, shown us that they've actually developed an aerial capacity as drones, and also, of course, their rocket power. So one last point maybe I want to mention is that Hezbollah released a lot of videos to reflect or to show some of its power as a deterrence. So it released these footage of strategic targets inside the occupied Palestine as part of what was known as the Hudhud, a series of drones. It released video footage of some of its bunkers inside the mountains with the long-range missiles. And this is all was intended to deter Israel.
So with that in mind, we have that Israeli escalation, as you mentioned, over the past month or so, with the, we can only describe as a mass terrorist attack with the pagers, mass mutilation, as you said, and the assassination of the top leadership, including Hassan Nasrallah, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. That was a severe blow to the resistance in many people's minds, especially because of the uniqueness of Hassan Nasrallah as a political figure and not just as a kind of military resistance figure. And we'll talk a little bit about the political implications next, but despite the assassination of the leadership, most of the kind of established leadership, the incumbent leadership of the party did not crumble, the resistance did not crumble, and there has been a fierce resistance to Israeli attacks, at least on the ground, and kind of the escalation of these dynamics. I know you're not a military expert, but given that you're a close observer, how would you describe the evolving military situation, both in terms of what Israel is trying to do, but also the actions of the resistance?
Sure. So let me first say that there's no question that the series of attacks that Israel launched, including the terrorist attack of the pager explosions, as well as the success in assassinating the top leadership, military leadership initially of Hezbollah, and then eventually, of course, the assassination of its, Secretary General Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. So these attacks, they were a success in the sense that because they all happened while committing war crimes. They were actually, whether it's the indiscriminate detonation of the pagers or is the massive bombardment of entire urban residential neighborhoods just to get at a single person, and usually using that as an excuse actually to terrorize the people of Dahi in this case. So the seriousness was that this was a security breach. It wasn't actually reflective of the weakness of the military prowess and performance on the battlefield of Hezbollah. And for a moment, actually, many people were worried about the implications of these attacks. And I'll get to the point. And so there are two levels here. One is the command and control capacity of Hezbollah, its ability to actually communicate with its field fighters, its ability to also plan and manage the war, as a leadership, as a military leadership. Also, Nasrallah is a symbol of what is referred to as the age of victories, not the age of defeats, because ever since he took office in the early 90s, we have generally seen victories for the resistance and defeats for Israel. So the ability of the Israelis to also assassinate him, shook up a little bit the confidence that people had in Hezbollah and its ability to continue on this path. So this was definitely, and I should also add, again, we go back to the media, because that's a powerful tool today. There was an immediate attempt to dismiss the ability of Hezbollah to regroup, to reorganize, and to continue its war. Now, what happened after that? As you mentioned, and I'll talk a little bit about the military situation. These attacks were a military breach, and they were also implemented via Israel's US-backed air superiority, the F-35s and the 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs, courtesy of US support. So right after that, the Israelis, it appears, thought that they could actually capture this moment and start an invasion of South Lebanon. And in the south of Lebanon, what we witnessed was incursions by what we are still witnessing. These are successive incursions by commando troops mostly through three areas. Lebanese border with Palestine. You've got this region in the eastern sector that is close to the finger of Galilee or the thumb of Galilee. These are places like Farkila or Adaisi, and on the other side you have the Mutalla, which is a settler colony on top of an old Arab village. And then you've got the middle sector and the waterfront. So they were repeatedly trying to incur and control regions and also test by fire the capacity of Israel to deter them. What we have seen since then is actually, despite the brutality and the success in quotation marks of Israel in displacing the majority of the population of this frontier, and its ability to enter sometimes, for a very short distance, it has failed to actually control any village. Not a single village has fallen under the control of Lebanon. And to give your viewers a perspective, the Israelis were able to, get to the outskirts of Beirut in '82 in 7 days. We've been now almost 3 weeks, and they haven't even able to capture a single village. So this shows you that in terms of the ground invasion, so far, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but so far, Hezbollah's capacity and other factions fighting with it has failed, has been able to actually withstand the Israeli invasion. On top of that, they're not only deterring the ground troops, they're actually daily firing rockets onto any kind of military congregations inside occupied Palestine. So any military enforcements that are coming in presumably to prepare for a large-scale invasion are still subject to Hezbollah fire. And on top of that, we have witnessed, as I think most of your viewers know, Hezbollah successfully attacking military bases all the way south of Haifa and launching on a daily basis dozens of rockets across, the entirety of historic Palestine. So this tells us that at least until now, Hezbollah's military capacity hasn't been affected as much as people assumed it might be after these series of attacks.
And going back to your comments about the calculated restraints, because of the overall strategic calculus, they're targeting military targets. And so was the Iranian missile attack in terms of, the mass bombing of civilians or the indiscriminate bombings that are targeting civilians is not being met with a previous kind of idea of a civilian for a civilian, which Nasrallah said that if you target civilians, we'll target that. But it's also showing that the actions have been far more rational and restrained than they are given credit for in the West, which actually flips the equation, sees the Israeli actions as restrained and the resistance axis as irresponsible. But in fact, they've been, relatively speaking, I think, far more responsible in terms of how they've been trying to avoid an all-out regional escalation, which Israel seems to have abandoned, which maybe brings us maybe to the political calculations and the implications. Maybe I'll ask you to comment on Lebanon first and foremost, but where do you see the regional situation going? We have lots of factors. As you mentioned at the beginning of the interview, you saw the elation of the US, especially in Washington, D.C., this kind of neocon dream being revived after the success of Israel. And even the voices that were urging restraint not because of any sense of decency or morality or international law, but because they were worried. But now, seemingly, even those voices are muted, and Israel has been given a free hand to escalate up until the latest round of deterrence by Iran and Hezbollah, which have, as you said, particularly in Hezbollah, pushed back. But we mentioned that Hezbollah is being attacked domestically by lots of media, by kind of sectarian kind of incitement by some factions. Israel's playing on those divisions. What do you think are the political implications, particularly because Hassan Nasrallah was the stature and standing of Hassan Nasrallah is no longer there as a counterweight. What do you think are the political implications in Lebanon? Where are things going? How are their voices trying to push back against this sectarian incitement? And maybe if you'd like to comment on the overall, where the region seems to be heading, you're welcome to do that as well.
All right, I'll try to address these points one by one to the best of my ability. Let me begin by your point about attacking civilians versus attacking military installations. As a matter of fact, before I joined you for this interview, I was watching a report by PBS about the very recent attack on the municipality of Nabateeh, which is a major town in South Lebanon, which is actually an ancient town. It goes all the way back to the Nabateans, and it's one of the centers of intellectual history, of intellectual production. It's a center of poets. It's a wonderful city. The Israelis bombed the municipality and killed the mayor, Dr. Ahmed Khail, and they also killed one of the most loved philanthropists of the region, Sadiq Isa, who was actually, you have pictures of him distributing bread. These people refused to leave Nabateeh and insisted on staying there. Now, this is another tactic, right? They've been bombing several municipal headquarters because that's where a lot of the aid happens. So they're really destroying the infrastructure to help distribute humanitarian aid. But my point here is, despite the fact that the correspondent of PBS spoke about the nature of these attacks, despite the fact that she explained that these individuals are employees of the municipality, they're not combatants. Even the same report, when it was tweeted by PBS, the title of the tweet was "Attacking Municipality Where Israel Says There Are Hezbollah Operatives." Like, this is how much the blindness of Western media is to this question of civilians versus combatants or fighters. Now, you know that there's this purity of arms, this complete, false narrative about the Israeli army. It's really impurity of arms. Historically, and I think both of us know, in colonial wars, there's always the blame on the colonized for using tactics that are considered terror tactics, whether it's the use of scalping by the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, or whether it's the bombing of cafes in Algeria. Now, the famous quote in Algeria is, if you gave us your F-16s, or I don't know what was the kind of plane back then, we can give you the baby carriages we use. This idea, the asymmetry of power. This is the point, asymmetrical power. What we are seeing today is purity of arms redefined. We are seeing what always has been the case with the Israeli army, this killing of civilians to kind of avenge the failure, the strategic failure of the Israeli military. On the other hand, we are seeing very calculated attacks by the axis of resistance on military targets. And despite all of that, of course, the image is inverted in the West. So that's the first point I want to make about the strategy, that the resistance, the moment it acquired the capacity to actually fight this war in a military way, it's been very much restrained in its attack. And when it's not, it's actually in retaliation for the attacking of civilians on the other side. Now, the second point I think you raised was about the implications of the war on the Lebanese domestic front and the strategy of trying to undermine the resistance from within. One thing that has been happening is the Israelis are bombing buildings or shelters where they are displaced from the south in regions that are primarily non-Shia. So they would bomb like a particular village that's Shia, or they would, and the majority of the population of the south are Shia, though we have, of course, other sects. And this is a way to try to tell people to stop housing or hosting these people. Now, I should mention, the majority of the people of Lebanon, from all backgrounds, Christian, Druze, Muslim, Sunni, they are all welcoming. The majority are welcoming. We shouldn't also just think that it's the other way around. But we have politicians and we have media outlets, including a famous outlet called the NTV, or a candidate for the Lebanese presidency, like his name is Michel Maouad. These people are coming out and parroting the Israeli claims that they're Hezbollah narrative. So the first strategy is to create civil strife and to start denying the displaced population the capacity to be hosted by other communities. That's the first strategy. And so far it's failed, but it's also, something that we have to worry about, because Lebanon lacks, the state of Lebanon and the civil society lack the capacity to fully manage and house and host its displaced population. So this is where individual initiatives become very important. And because of the nature of the media, then people might start getting worried. I mean, I have to say, some people are worried that if they do house, in their home or in their building, the Israelis are going to come after them. So that's the first strategy. The second one is political. One of the things that, that keeps coming up is the idea of disarming Hezbollah. And this is where Resolution 1701 comes into place. The idea is that in order for this war to end, there has to be a deployment of the Lebanese army, a redeployment of the Lebanese army in the south, and a disarming of the resistance. Ironically, of course, the Israelis are bombing the Lebanese army. They killed at least 2 or 3 soldiers in the last month. They're also bombing UNIFIL, the United Nations troops in South Lebanon. They want them to evacuate. So while the Israelis are actually blatantly violating 1701, most of the media is focused on disarming the resistance. The Lebanese army has a strategic alliance with the United States. The Lebanese army is an impoverished army as a result of corruption and the financial crisis of 2019. It's been receiving aid from Qatar for, fuel subsidies. It has received up to $3 billion from the United States since 2006. The majority of this money goes to internal security, which is used to repress the Lebanese population if they're actually protesting Lebanese government officials. None of this money is actually permitted to be used to buy defensive, not even offensive weaponry. So what I'm trying to say is there's an attempt to reimpose the plan of 2006 to actually, even though now we have 15,000 UN troops in the south, even though until October 8th, there was no visible presence of Hezbollah south of Litani, so they weren't technically violating 1701, even though the Israelis were constantly violating it through their air attacks or like the violations through airspace, even though now the official Lebanese government is endorsing 1701, which, by the way, does not impose anything close to what it imposes on Lebanon on Israel. We are still seeing the circulation and the promotion of a political solution of disarming the resistance and of replacing it by the Lebanese army, which, as I said, is neither military capable nor ideologically and politically ready to actually defend the south of Lebanon from Israeli attacks. So the worry is that with the Nasrallah gone, he was a very powerful political presence in Lebanon. Hezbollah's political leadership now almost in hiding, not all of it, but some of the major figures, that it's possible that the other Lebanese actors see this as a weakness and try to actually push a solution that is, potentially in favor of Israel's plan. The last point I think you raised is the new Middle East and what's going to happen in the war and the future of this conflict. Now, obviously, I think it's very hard to predict what's going to happen. This is a situation that's evolving, almost day by day. But I'm going to share some of my thoughts on this. The first thought I have is we know that since the Ukraine war, whatever semblance of international order there was in terms of managing conflict has gone is no more there. So this means that these current wars have no ceiling. And this means that diplomacy is only a last means of reflecting facts on the ground. This also means that the United States and Israel are not going to, and specifically Israel, is not going to feel deterred except if they are actually faced by a credible military threat. So my point here is, no one knows how long this war is going to last, but it can last for a very long time. We may see this war continue well beyond, this year. It also depends on what happens once the elections, the U.S. elections are done. I don't see, I worry about further escalation, not about de-escalation after the U.S. election. So that's the first point I want to make. And maybe I want to add that we have to ask, why is China, for example, not taking a stronger position on the Middle East? If the Israelis, the expansionist plan or the reshaping of the Middle East plan happens, this, I would assume, is going to impact China's presence in the. So this is another question. This is on the international level. On the regional level, we can't talk enough about the complete lack of agency or influence of Arab states and Arab governments, and particularly the complicity of these Arab regimes and Arab governments. I think many people are very well aware of the normalization plans of the Saudis and the UAE. But what is really completely inexcusable is the position of Jordan and Egypt, because ultimately, had at least Egypt insisted on keeping Rafah open, or insisted on letting the aid through to Gaza, or insisted on the withdrawal of the Israelis from the Philadelphia corridor or the Salahuddin corridor. So another dynamic that we see here is the complete collapse of any political pressure or role that the Arab governments can play. So far, what I've listed are in favor of Israel. These are the forces that kind of favor the Israeli plan. Now, on the other hand, what we have is, for the first time, perhaps, an axis of resistance that is still coordinating among its different factions, that is actually has built its military power in a way that is capable of at least inflicting substantive damage on Israel, of preventing an Israeli victory, which usually in asymmetric warfare is a victory, of actually drawing Israel into this prolonged war in a manner that's perhaps increasing the contradictions within Israeli society. I think today we have two main things to look for. The first is what will happen on the Lebanese southern front. If the resistance is able to deter the Israelis from actually invading, that's going to be a major win that will have a very strong impact on the Israelis. The second one is the response of Iran. How far is Iran going to go in order to deter Israel? I think many people thought that the responses so far, as significant as the last one is not enough. And Hezbollah is the cornerstone of the non-state actors within this axis. And if this cornerstone is undermined, then Iran's own foreign, political, regional presence is also undermined. So it's a difficult balancing, like it's a difficult equation, and of course the costs of the war keep rising. But I want to emphasize that without this resistance, the Israeli project would have been accomplished, anyway. So the only way to kind of push back against it is to continue resisting in all forms possible. Otherwise, we're going to see this so-called new Middle East as basically, I'm thinking of a Mad Max movie situation, this settler colonial expansionist fascist state presiding over a region that's immiserated, that's actually depopulated around this entity. And this is why so far they have failed, despite all the costs. And these, so long, I would say, as the internal contradictions within Lebanon and the Arab region and Iran, if they stay strong, the Israeli plan is hard to fully implement in the long run. Yeah, that's how I see it. But again, it's very difficult to. I would obviously, if at some point the Israelis recognize, or there's something that changes within Israel that they cannot continue because of the losses, we might see a compromise, we might see a settlement, but I'm not sure how that's like. It's become a zero-sum game almost. So and the intransigence of the Israeli state is quite hardened, of course, by also U.S. and Western support.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hicham. That lays out actually a lot of interesting and important questions for further analysis, which we hope to continue, especially about the forces in the region and internationally, the role of China and Russia, and where that might go. There's a lot of speculation about that, but we'll leave that for another discussion. Thank you so much for your clear analysis and your commentary. I think it's been very useful to hear you articulate them despite the complications. I hope you stay safe. I hope this aggression ends as soon as possible. But as you said, there are lots of reasons to be pessimistic, but also reasons to see the pushback and the resistance as being the major and the only deterrent at this point. So we'll see how that goes, and hopefully we'll continue this discussion at another time. And really, thank you so much for everything. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and also for giving security a good reputation, Omar, which is generally not the case. So I really appreciate the critical approach that you and others have been actually adopting to undermine and to deconstruct the typical use of security as a means of actually dominance and dispossession and oppression.
Thank you, Hicham.
Thank you.